Alrighty, well, this episode of Arrow, boy, the season's almost over. Seems like it just flew by, or at least it does in hindsight. But this episode of Arrow was one that I really enjoyed. And for a few reasons, actually. Granted, it had a few problems that sort of hampered it looking back, or even while watching it, I was kind of picking up on these problems and kind of picking out, this scene doesn't really seem like it belongs in the rest of this episode. But basically, the plot of this is following up immediately with what happened in the last episode. The mayor is assassinated by Maceo, dressed as the Arrow, and Detective Lance, or Captain Lance now, he basically issues a citywide manhunt for the Arrow and his accomplices. So this basically leads to the majority of the episode, or at least the first half of the episode, essentially being just one big chase scenario. Oliver is still trying to find Maceo and stop this whole, framing him in an attempt to get him to join the League of Assassins. He's still trying to stop Ra's al Ghul, while at the same time he has to contend with Captain Lance, and who feels very, very betrayed by really everything that is having to do with the Arrow. And eventually in the episode, Ra's al Ghul gets in contact with Captain Lance and tells him Oliver is the Arrow. So that actually leads Captain Lance to go on give a televised statement proclaiming Oliver's identity to the whole cities. So it's basically what would have it's basically what would have eventually happened to Robert Downey Jr.'s Iron Man if he hadn't given away his identity at the end of the first movie. So in the flashbacks, Oliver and Maceo's son are still on the run from presumably Argus agents. It hasn't really identified them yet, but they actually take refuge in the home of Shadow's twin sister. Wrap your head around that. She's once again played by Selena Jade, and at the same time, Ray Palmer has been injured by an arrow that was meant for Felicity, and he's trying to get the doctors to give the okay on this experimental nanotech operation where he basically sends a bunch of tiny little robots to eliminate this blood clot that could potentially give him brain damage, and if they try to remove it, then it could result in death. So that's basically everything that's going on in this episode. Now, first of all, let's tackle the bad first, because honestly, there's not really a whole lot of bad stuff in this episode. Once again, the stuff with Ray Palmer and Felicity feels like it's from an entirely different show, and I think part of that is sort of deliberate, but it doesn't really make it any more. It doesn't really improve the quality or improve how it affects the rest of the episode, because as you probably guessed, they are really kind of charging forward with establishing Ray Palmer as his own separate character, so that he can eventually transition to the other show that they've got planned that doesn't have a title yet. So once again, it feels the scenes with him and Felicity feel very disconnected from everything else that's going on, and honestly, it feels very sort of distracting. And again, it's kind of jarring when we're going from some heavy drama regarding Oliver, the League of Assassins, and Captain Lance, and all of a sudden we go back to Ray Palmer, who by comparison is very lighthearted. Even when he's faced with death, he tackles that subject with a smirk on his face. Again, sort of like Tony Stark. So that really didn't do much for me in the context of this episode. And when it comes to the flashbacks, first of all, Charlotte Ross is back as Felicity's mom. She's a lot of fun. And at the same time, in the flashbacks, we have Selena Jade back, not as Shadow, but as Shadow's twin sister. Now, first of all, while it was good to see Selena Jade back on the show, and she does a really good job, and the scenes between her and Stephen Amell, as he's basically trying to tell her, I knew your father and your sister, and they're not here anymore. They're dead. I mean, those were some pretty heavy dramatic scenes, and I get the feeling that this would have worked on its own just fine if they weren't trying to stick it into the rest of the episode. But first of all, how they set this up is basically Oliver and Maceo's son are roaming the streets when all of a sudden they run into Shadow's sister. And so first of all, not only do we have to do we have to accept that Shadow has a twin sister. Not only do we have to accept that she lives in Hong Kong, which is conveniently the place where Oliver ended up after being on the island for 2 years, but we are also expected to buy that roaming randomly around the street, Oliver just happened to bump into Shadow's sister at this exact moment. So, okay. I can suspend my disbelief a lot when it comes to a comic book TV show. And I can even suspend my disbelief outside of a comic book context when it just comes to, what can serve the story or what can elicit real drama. But even this was really pushing it. But once I was able to look past that, or at least to a certain extent, I was really getting invested in their scenes. But again, it doesn't really tie much into what's going on in the rest of the episode. It's really only loosely tied to the rest of the episode thematically toward the end when she gives the saying, nothing is more powerful than the truth, or something like that. It's very loosely tied together thematically with the present day stuff at the end with one line of dialogue. So again, these two subplots were sort of distracting, honestly. They would have worked fine on their own, but again, they were sort of distracting. But let's get to the good. Now, first of all, how this episode is structured and how all these characters are behaving and how and where a lot of the drama is coming from. It was very reminiscent of an episode of Batman the Animated Series, specifically Season 4, The New Batman Adventures. The episode is called Over the Edge. And basically, I'm not going to give away the twist ending, but basically it involves Batgirl being killed by the Scarecrow and Commissioner Gordon, partially out of grief, going on this sort of citywide manhunt for Batman and his associate. And it's this really heart-wrenching 22 minutes, or was it 22 minutes? It might have been actually a bit more since it was made several years ago, but it's this very, very heavy dramatic episode. And Bruce Wayne's identity as Batman is revealed. So really there's nowhere left for him to go. And a lot of the scenes in this episode, and even the premise, is very reminiscent of that episode. I have to wonder, were they paying homage to that, or was that just coincidentally how the story of this episode ended up giving what has been happening in the show up to this point? Honestly, I would accept either one, but really that's what was going through my mind, because this episode permeated with scenes that were reminiscent of the Over the Edge episode. So I have to say, really, really heavy dramatic stuff in the present day, and the present day was the most interesting portion of this episode because it is such a rush, and it is so, again, heavy, and at times really, really emotional, with these actors giving really, really standout performances. I was just so compelled, more compelled than I've been in several episodes in regards to the present day stuff. It's very engrossing stuff, all things considered. Because first of all, you have this really, really nail-biting action scene at the beginning of the episode where Team Arrow, Oliver, Roy, and Laurel are basically forced to split up and go and try to outrun the police. So that alone was pretty exhilarating. I would have been satisfied with that. But basically the rest of the episode deals with these characters really having to come to terms with the fact that not only are things not going to be the same, but there's a very real possibility that they're not going to walk out of this as free people, free men and free women, in the case of Felicity, and Laurel. Actually, Laurel doesn't count as a person. I kid. So really, really heavy stuff, and it all culminated very beautifully in Oliver turning himself in. and yeah, really well done, because and really good job on the part of Paul Blackthorne in particular. I mean, all the actors were good in this episode. You know, Stephen Amell still shines. David Ramsey, Emily Bett Rickards, all these guys, really, really good job. But Paul Blackthorne in particular, you can really sense, not just in the script, but also in his performance, the real sense of betrayal that he feels, not just towards Laurel at this point, but towards the Arrow, someone who he actually believed in at one point, someone who, in spite of having this really dead set of values in regards to what is right and what is wrong in regards to upholding the law, he pushed all that aside because he believed that he was doing good with the Arrow. He actually suspended his beliefs and worked with a vigilante for what he believed was the greater good. And now that suddenly comes crashing down. Not only does that come crashing down in the face of these apparent killings, but also he learns that the Arrow in reality is much more closer to home and much closer to his family than he previously thought. You can really feel the sense of pain and confusion that this character is going through, and a lot of that really has to do with Paul Blackthorne's performance. So yeah, really, really engrossing stuff. And yeah, in conjunction with that, you still have the action scenes. You still have the stuff that I think comic book fans would expect from a comic book show. In that we want some action. This episode gives you action, but it's action that again is permeated with just really, really heavy stuff and a real sense of going into uncharted territory, because now that the whole city knows that Oliver Queen is the Arrow, there's really no telling where it's going to go. So really excited, more so than ever for the next episode, more so than probably I've ever been in this season. I know I'm just sort of repeating myself at this point, but it was a really good one. Bam.